Hello, everyone. I'm Zach. I'm the Senior Director of Guest Experience and Engagement at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This week, our Founders Week, we're celebrating the 164th anniversary of the Chicago Academy of Sciences with a variety of programming, including this discussion. I want to take a moment to thank our event sponsor of Founders Week, Rose Pest Solution, for their support of the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum. If you have not already, please visit our website, naturemuseum.org, to sign up to our bi-weekly newsletter to receive announcements about programming, events, and other ways to see what's going on with us. If you're able, please make a donation at naturemuseum.org to help events like this continue to happen. Now, back to today's event. For optimal viewing, please turn your video layout to speaker view located at the top right of the screen. If you have questions for the panelists, please enter them in the chat. We'll be asking panelist questions from the audience towards the end of the program. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it to the President and CEO of the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum, Deb Leahy.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you for joining us and joining in tonight's dialogue for the topic, Tainted Knowledge, Reconciling Scientific Achievements with Their Problematic Scientists. Broadly speaking, within the science community, there are individuals living and deceased who have made foundational discoveries which advance science for all of us. Yet some have problematic histories that are not limited to racism, sexism, and colonialist tendencies. How do we in today's world reconcile the significant advances these individuals have given science in the world with their flaws? How can we learn from others that have grappled with this dilemma? Is the science or the scientists to be rejected? This is a topic that we ourselves are exploring. As Zach mentioned, we're celebrating our 164th year, and we begin with self-reflection and discovery. We're looking at our role of educator, collaborator, connecting communities to science and nature. We're exploring our own history of the both institution of the Chicago Academy of Sciences and Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum, and our founders. It's an interesting world, and we are really looking forward to all of this exploration. So this evening, as we begin this process, and it is just a beginning, we are going to move forward with intention and while acknowledging our past, and we're inviting you to join us to learn and unpack with us. So without further ado, my turn to say that, I am delighted to welcome and turn the evening over to Kurt Miney, Aldo Leopold Scholar, and tonight's moderator. Kurt, to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much. And welcome to everyone from all the vast geographies. And I'm looking at the names on our screens here and seeing how widely represented Turtle Island is. And beyond, perhaps. So I'm delighted to be here and to be with you all, and I'm wishing you all well wishes and good health wherever you are. And I'm deeply honored. I want to first say, just listening to you, Deborah, reminded me that I was 9 years old when my family moved to Chicago, and I was an innocent young man and walked through the doors of the old Museum of the Chicago Academy of Sciences for the first time. And it was a life-changing moment for me. I didn't know this history. I didn't know the flaws in the history. I didn't know the science. It was an introduction for me in a very important way that I won't go into tonight. But we are all shaped by the institutions, the places, the people, the knowledge bases that shape who we are and how we think about these very important questions that we're going to be speaking to tonight. I won't say too much in way of introduction because we have such an amazing panel of guests here, and I want to give maximum amount of time to their voices. But I will just say as a quick word of introduction that this is a conversation tonight that we're going to have that I have been long interested in. It's been long in the making, and it's long overdue. And we can't do it all in one night. We can get a good start. We can advance the discussion and conversation, and I know that our guests will help us do that. But it's also the beginning, perhaps, of a continuing, or at least an advancing point, let's say that, of a conversation about our institutions, about individuals in history, but also about where we are now and where we're going. So I'll just leave it at that, because we'll be circling around, I'm sure, to many of the same themes. So I have just gotten to know the faces on your screen in the last week or so. I've been reading a little bit of their backgrounds and their work, and I'm honored again to be among so many, and if I dare say, younger, except maybe Louise, you and I are roughly the same age, but in general, we are the elders in this gang. So I'm especially delighted to see younger scientists, scholars, and thinkers joining us tonight with their varied interests, backgrounds, and fields that they bring to us tonight, and geographies as well. So I'm gonna first ask us to go around and to have our guests introduce themselves. I will just name them, and we'll ask them to say a few words about your own work, your home fields, and maybe where you're coming in from too. And I will just briefly say I'm coming to you all from the banks of the Wisconsin River west of Madison, Wisconsin. I am in a rural place, and I've warned my colleagues here that if I should freeze up on you, that's because of my rural internet service. I will unfreeze pretty rapidly if past is any guidance. So with that, I'm going to go as I see folks on my screen here, which I know it varies, but I'm going to start with our friend who is farthest afield, Louise. Louise, I'm going to actually try to say your name because I've practiced it now twice. Louise. No, maybe I'll just let you say your own name for us. Louise. Uh-oh, got to unmute. Louise, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah,
there we go.
The mouse was playing on me. Okay, my name is Louise Alberto Herrera Gil. I am basically interested, well, my field of study is paleontology and paleobiology, basically. And I was professor researcher is our figure in our university. I'm retired from the University of Baja California Sur. And I worked there for 42 years. Okay, now I'm presently retired. And as a matter of fact, my work mainly had to deal with teaching students from the geology career, the marine biology career, and also do connection projects. One of the, pioneering with the three Californias. University of California, Los Angeles, Campus Northridge, we made a certificate program integrating the geology, the paleontology, the biology, and the cultural traits of the three Californias, Southern, Baja Sur, Baja Norte, and California. And that gave us a very good glimpse of what can be done with long distance learning. And now it's becoming very useful in this epoch, okay? That's what we're doing now. We were learning at a big distance, thank you to this technology, okay? And that was one of our first big projects was that. It was in the early 90s, okay, that we did the project. And As a detail, I will tell you that in a project with the Canadian geneticists, I found out I have the mitochondrial DNA of the Paleo Indians of the peninsula. I didn't know that. So I went to live and work where my long gone ancestors lived. Okay. That was very nice to learn. I will share with you the documentary about that in further readings and further contacts. Okay. And okay, the subjects I teach is biology, paleobiology, paleontology, geological history, paleoanthropology, paleoecology, and ecology. Those were the subjects I taught during these 40 years. Okay, I think it's enough.
Very good. Thank you so much, Louise. To the right on you on my screen is Adam Kessel.
Thank you. First, I want to just say I'm honored to be speaking before everybody and with this great panel today. My name is Adam Kessel. I'm a program coordinator with the Forest Preserves of Cook County. I'm an educator. I'm a father, a musician.
Okay.
And I'm a member of the Native American community here in Chicago. I'm Lakota, Italian, and German. And I was part of the committee that wrote the land acknowledgement statement for the Cook County Forest Preserves. And I look forward to having this conversation with everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Sheila Kola.
There, I'm Sheela Kola. I'm an assistant professor at New York University in Toronto. I study pollinator conservation, and I am a settler in Canada. My mother came to Canada as a refugee from Trinidad, and my dad is Italian. So I am doing a lot of work around thinking about my position and my research as a settler in Canada, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about it a little bit more later, but that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Sheila. And Taylor Ray Tate.
Hello, everyone. I would also like to just say thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy and excited to be here. I'm going to be speaking on these topics. My pronouns are she, her. I am an herbalist and herbal educator. I graduated from Northwestern University with a degree in environmental science, and I was lucky enough that during my time there, I was able to do a fair amount of work with the Chicago Botanic Gardens as a research assistant and field research assistant. During that time, I kind of dove in and fell in love with plants, with ecology. I was also working on some projects around pollination biology while being there under my professors. And after graduating, I kind of took that and expanded it, my love for studying and learning about the relationships between different organisms and plants. And I kind of expanded that into humans because it was something that I never really got to touch on that much. And so I am really passionate about herbal medicine and kind of diving into the mutualisms that have evolved between plants and humans. Much of what I study is integrative in terms of utilizing traditional herbal medicine as well as incorporation of Western models, phytotherapy, and things of that nature. I currently just completed recently a 2-year apprenticeship with an AHG certified clinical herbalist, and I'm currently studying under another AHG certified clinical herbalist, botanist, and medic, and working at a free clinic out here in upstate New York. And that's a little bit about me, and I'm so happy to be here again.
Thank you. Thank you, Taylor, and thank you again to everyone. We have an amazing conversation ahead of us, I think. We'll try to do our best to cover a set of questions that we've been working with the Notebaert Museum staff to develop. And we could literally spend an hour or maybe even a few weeks on each of the questions that we've all been sharing with each other here in our panel over the last few days. But we'll do our best to let everyone speak as much as they like to as many of these points. And we're going to start with a really basic question. And it's one that I find fascinating and I've thought about a lot myself. And that is how much we, in our role as scientists, and we know we all have different roles in our lives. So we put on our scientist hat sometimes during the day or at night or whenever, and we go off and we have other roles we play. Adam's a musician. Taylor spends a lot of times with plants, not just describing them scientifically, right? So the question is how much we as scientists need to pay attention to the history of our fields. And there's kind of a built-in paradox here, isn't there? That as scientists, generally, you get rewarded for being up to date on the latest, greatest, hottest new discoveries and publications. And you're supposed to keep up with whatever was published 3 hours ago. And then you have to forget that because something else was just published. And so that works in some weird ways against actually perceiving and thinking about and absorbing the deep history of the science, much less the history outside the science. So I'm going to open it up for this. I love this question as a starter because it helps us each to understand each other of how we navigate those different worlds and those different timescales. So I'd welcome any of our panelists to chime in here. And I see Adam, maybe you would like to kick us off if you can on how you think about your responsibility to know the history of your own field or in general science.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm an educator and an interpreter with the forest preserves, and as part of that, I get to kind of stand on the shoulders of giants in the science field and interpret their science to the public. But it's important to note that the land is storied. And science is essentially a way of understanding and creating a story and explanation on phenomena in the land, many of which these stories have existed for millennia with indigenous people. So knowing the story of the land and making sure that we're not privileging one or the other and acknowledging, right, for today, acknowledging the fact that we're presenting, at least for me, I'm in Chicago, I'm presenting and I'm on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires. And acknowledging the First Nations people as we do when we present or when we engage in scientific practices. So I think I'm going to pass it over now with that to another panelist.
And panelists, unmute yourself as you wish. But Sheila, I see you just unmuted.
Yeah, I could take a stab at it. I guess my field is entomology, which is very much like an older white male field. I don't know if it's more than any other field of ecology, but it feels like it is, and it still is. So definitely when I was learning the basics, my resources would have all been written by white men. And I only really started to think more about situating what I'm doing within the history of colonialism more broadly when I realized that it still is so relevant to how my work is interpreted today and who uses my work and how my work is used. So for an example, I study at-risk bumblebees. You've heard a lot about Save the Bees in North America and Canada, that this message really has been co-opted to save the European honeybee, which is a non-native species, obviously, in the US and Canada. And I've been really thinking about how this message of, declining pollinators and the ecosystem services that they provide to our native plants, many of which are culturally, medicinally important plants, especially to Indigenous people, how that has been co-opted by the beekeeping industry, by beekeepers, by politicians, grain farmers. There's so much money and power that has come into play in this topic that I really just thought people would value because it's an important topic on its own. So I really got thrown in, just as an ecologist, which is a pure science background, I really got into, I got thrown into this environmental issue that so many people care about, and that now has all of these kind of threads of colonialism and capitalism and power kind of going through it. So that's sort of where I realized that I actually cannot divorce what I'm doing right now to our colonial history. So now I'm trying to sort of think back about where these connections to nature were lost, and who's co-opting the message, and where is the money going, and where's the money coming from, for research, for implementation of conservation management. Obama put together a partnership in the context of where are beekeepers going to be able to bring their bees so they would be able to feed. So there's just so much going on there, and that's when I realized that I really need to pay attention to the history, not so much about specific individuals, but more as like a thread that's kind of being carried towards it. And I don't want to be, I mean, I am a part of the system, but I'm trying very hard to sort of not be a part of the system where I can.
Mm. Thank you, Sheila. Yeah. And we have this challenge when you're getting trained, you know, in your graduate school work, especially if you're in the sciences, often paying attention to that contextualized history is if it's not actively encouraged, sometimes it's actually discouraged because it takes you away from the work it's supposed to be focused on. And I'm wondering if Louise or Taylor, you'd like to comment on that too, how in your own development, in your own training, whether you were encouraged or not to think about the history of your field.
So I could speak to a little bit about like herbal medicine and how history relates with that. I think generally, not only does acknowledging and studying the history of our fields within the science, but everywhere offer for opportunity to have a deeper understanding and knowledge of that field. I think the way that, as you know, Sheila mentioned, that white supremacy colonialism works, it's very all-consuming. And I think virtually most of the sciences or most fields of studies have forms of, backbone or undertones of colonialism and white supremacy within them. And I think a failure to learn about these things just sets us up to perpetuate some of the harm and the violence that they cause. Within the realm of herbal medicine, I think it's kind of always been encouraged to understand the histories just because herbal medicine is inherently traditional, but that doesn't mean it is totally outside of the colonial or Western viewpoint or influence. Very much of what is considered Western herbal medicine now has really deep influences in Indigenous culture and Black culture, but that is often misrepresented in the way that we operate with it within it now. And it has also been, co-opted especially as capitalism has been getting its hand on herbal medicine and popularizing it through that kind of framework. So actively, I think one thing that me and a lot of people within my community aim to do is to really bring light to these histories that have been forgotten, because many of them are. That is like a function of white supremacy and erasure of peoples, erasures of cultures. And so, while herbal medicine is semi-historical, I'm definitely not immune to this. And I would hope that, in most fields, people are encouraged and have a desire to learn about these histories just to mitigate harm, really.
Thank you, Taylor. I think especially your field has been a bridge field when I think about my friends who are ethnobotanists and how important that field has been as a model to other fields, perhaps, of how to try to overcome some of these tensions and differences and conflicts. Yeah. Louise, if you have a comment on this, if you could unmute yourself and share some of your thoughts with your many different fields, actually, that you shared.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yes. My answer to that question is an absolute and big yes. Every subject I teach has an historical introduction. And there are, sometimes I'm criticized because there are many days that I dedicate to that. And it's in a practical ground first, because it's important, not the history of the people, but of the ideas, the evolution of the ideas in the field. Okay, that's the first, and that's practical. So nobody is inventing again what somebody did already. Okay, and the other part is the cultural context. That society, in what moment it was, how this was an influence on the ideas being born there, the the philosophical framework, okay, and also now talking about the individuals, we learn that every individual is different. Yeah, his qualities, their qualities are different, and importantly, their errors are different, and their flaws are different too. And in this panel, we're talking about those flaws. Okay, some were misogynist, some were racist, but there are different depths on that. Okay, different depths, and we have to understand that these people were people of their time. Okay, and sometimes these ideas were in the air. They didn't conceive them. It was something they learned from childhood and didn't question in all of their lives. And some of them also were intentional. Okay, it's all this spectrum from the unconscious racism, for example, to the blatant open racism. So, and every personage is different on this. So we have to be very conscious of that. And separate, that you say, the science. Okay. In the case of paleontology, we have several examples of that. And well, the ideas are there, but we have to be conscious of the people that conceive them, and their good ideas, their bad ideas. Okay, that for the students it's important to have that very clear, because we will be judged in the future like we are judging them. So these ideas we have now can be wrong in a century, for example, and we will be criticized. Okay, as we are criticizing them. So that's my point.
Thank you. Actually, Louise, in your answer, you gave a perfect lead-in to what we were going to move to next. And I appreciate that answer very much so, as both a conservation biologist and a biographer who focused on a particular life of a naturalist in my own work, and understanding how these large forces play out in individual lives. And so for our other panels, you really did lead us into this next question, that in all our different fields and in the environmental and natural sciences in general, there are practices, individuals, and institutions in our history that are deeply problematic, obviously. And all of us have to wrestle with that or overcome it, both. And so, as Louise just mentioned, how in your own work and practice and thinking and teaching, how do you try to do that to our other panelists here? In what ways do you see this at work in your own scientific research or in your own teaching? And how do you think about separating the science from the scientists or the scientific institutions? How do you wrestle? I guess is a way of asking that. And I'll open it up to our other panelists here. Adam?
Yeah. For my field, it's kind of a question of access to land, right? So in our practice, how are we creating opportunities so that there's equitable access to public lands? And how do we create opportunities for folks to feel safe and welcomed in these places? And kind of even just backing up and thinking about the ways in which we engage with communities and ask for knowledge. I mean, it kind of takes us on a little trajectory, but at one point in time, I was part of a community-based research project on learning sciences in the Native community here in Chicago with Northwestern. And as part of the community design research, the community was designing the project, right? So it wasn't a big, massive research institution coming into a community and saying, I want to study this, that, and the other. It was a community, a researcher coming in and engaging with the community and working that into the way in which this research was happening, this scientific research, because essentially we're asking for knowledge. Now, this was more of a sociological research project, but even if we're looking at land research, imagine for a second that you're doing land research on ecological research in community. People are living amongst the areas that you're researching. What would opportunities look like to engage community around these practices? And what's the reciprocity? If you're gaining knowledge, how is that knowledge being shared? How is that impacting the betterment of the communities that you're doing this research in or around? So one of the ways that we've been doing that is employing people. When I was in this project, a bunch of high school students were research assistants. I was a community member and a college student. I was a community research and teacher. So the university employed many people from the community to gather data, interpret the data, do all of this, and that heavily influenced my career as an adult. So it's work like that where we're engaging community in the design process and the research process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, Taylor or Sheila, your thoughts on this? Adam just gave us a great example of in his practice shifting from this, researcher comes in and extracts knowledge to a more community-based model of cooperative and reciprocal knowledge sharing and creating, and doing that with proper respect and protocol. So Taylor and Sheila, perhaps you have some examples from your own work of addressing, this legacy of problematic science.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the biggest things when we're coming into contact with problematic science, and one of the biggest things that we can do in any of our field, and solely just a jumping off point, is being really transparent about acknowledging it.
Yeah, I definitely struggle with this.
I think it's like a delay and it's cutting out. But acknowledging it and having transparency within it. I know within herbal medicine that looks like acknowledging the harms that have been happening both in the context of herbal medicine, but also in the context of the history and the medical field. The history of medicine in the U.S. And really, I can just speak to the U.S. is the use of a lot of Indigenous and Black knowledge, but also the use of the Indigenous and Black bodies for violence. There was a high amount of experimentation done on Black people, enslaved people, in order to have a lot of the, where we are today in the medical field. And looking at medicine now, we often don't have the same amount of access, something that Adam also mentioned, to marginalized communities. And so much of reconciling with these pasts within the context of herbal medicine, within the context of phytotherapy and ecology, which have deep histories of the taking of land and not giving authority to the Indigenous peoples on the land to make decisions around it, putting people's lives in danger, their resources in danger, is very much an acknowledgement, but also now working towards helping to resolve and provide resources for those people who have been marginalized by the histories. And so within herbal medicine, that means teaching these histories and giving people resources on how to better understand herbal medicine and really empower them to be able to utilize some of these methods to help their own health. That looks like, working at free clinics with me and my colleagues so that people can have better access to these medicines, better access to, procedures and things like that that are going to help them in the long run. So I think joint acknowledging and also kind of going back and providing these resources, providing education, involving the communities in these things are all really important in, this process.
Thank you, Taylor. Sheila, are you with us?
I think so. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, there you are.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so I guess there's a couple ways that I'm thinking about this. I definitely struggle with the accolade part of it, like always celebrating the white men in the field who, like in the case of Darwin, a lot of the work was because of, actual colonialism, traveling, exploring the world. And then also as a result of things like class and privilege. So I do struggle because we do teach these things in our courses. So I try to balance that kind of work with, other voices of people of color, Indigenous voices. I really like Robin Kimmerer's work. So I try to incorporate that as much as possible. In terms of my own research, I've recently started working with my colleague, Lisa Myers, in the same faculty as me, and we are thinking about producing knowledge, co-creating knowledge around plants and pollinators and the relationships that they have and the relationships that people have with the plants that are pollinated, and trying to do this in a way that's sensitive. So we have a project called Finding Flowers, which you can find on Instagram and on Twitter. And it's inspired by a late Mi'kmaq artist, Mike McDonald, who actually planted pollinator gardens as a form of resistance back in the 90s and early 2000s. And which is really interesting because now it's so mainstream to have a pollinator garden on your front lawn in your suburban household or whatever. But he was inspired to plant these pollinator gardens as a response to some logging that he saw in British Columbia and wondering where the butterflies were going to live. So he went across Canada and planted pollinator gardens. So with this project, we are replanting some of these gardens and just sort of having conversations with people who knew of him and learning about how thoughtful he was about what plants were planted there. And Lisa Myers is doing amazing work on the history to really understand how he incorporated tension, like colonialism. So there's a lot of native plants in the gardens, but he also seems to have also incorporated some of the tension by maybe planting like one sort of invader plant. So there's a lot to learn there, and we're using these gardens as spaces to have these really hard conversations. So we kind of joke that we are bringing people in with like bees and flowers, and then we're talking about things like resistance and colonialism and broken relationships of people on the land and their medicines. So that's sort of how I'm kind of getting into it now, but mostly in collaboration.
Thank you. Oh boy. I'm going to resist saying all the things that are going through my head right now because I just love your point there at the end about how you start with something everyone appreciates and understands at a basic level, like pollinators or pollinator gardens, but that opens up these larger questions and helps us to get into them in a way that can be productive. Louise, do you have any thoughts on this that you would like to share as well?
Oh, well, yes. How we address this, we say in the question, what to reconcile the problematic scientists? How do we rescue the science? Well, by being honest about that first. Yeah, that's the first thing. We have many examples in my fields. For example, George Cuvier, okay? He is very well known in paleobiology and paleontology because he was very egomaniac, very racist, and very intolerant, and very terrible in many aspects. But he was also a very brilliant scientist. We owe him in biology, for example, comparative anatomy. You cannot do biology without comparative anatomy. Also, in paleontology, he related function and form, okay, morphology and function. Is the father of functional morphology, for example. In geology, he is the father of catastrophism, a scientific doctrine what was rescued philosophically because of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. So we have to be honest about that. Okay, how he classified the races was really racist, profoundly racist, and at a certain point it was intentional. Okay, so we have to be honest about that too. So we have to separate that because he was a man of his epoch. Okay, those ideas were in the air at the moment, but he adopted them and was intentional in his racism too. Racism. Sorry, my English is very oxidized now, as I said. So I think it's a thing of being honest about that. Mm-hmm. Not trying to seclude or adulterate or no. We owe our students, we owe them honesty about that. Okay.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was looking at our question again, and at that word that you keyed in on, reconcile. And if there's a lesson of our recent history of the last generation, is there's no reconciliation without the truth part, right? Truth and reconciliation go together, and you cannot separate them. And so that gets us into our next, we're kind of digging and diving deeper as we get into the conversation here. So we've talked about the need to pay attention to the history of our scientific fields. We've talked about trying to wrestle with that problematic history. But now as you get deeper and deeper into it, we have to separate those current or surface symptoms that we all recognize and that we increasingly recognize with the deeper systemic causes and roots of these problems as well. And I think this is something that all of us, especially in the last year, from all our different perspectives, have been even more focused on. I think all of us too have focused on these in our own work. But to the panelists, we know about the symptoms, whether it's the representation in our institutions, in our positions of influence, appropriation that goes on, the history of displacement, the interspecies relationships that we're all concerned about. These are terrible symptoms, but we also are at a point, an inflection point, where we have to start wrestling with these deeper systemic causes of all this. And it's one thing for me to say that, it's another thing for all our panelists to say it as well, each in our different worlds that we're coming from. So let's have this conversation. Let's see. I welcome anybody in our panel to say how your thinking is right now, because we've all been, especially under these current circumstances, probably thinking more deeply about this than we ever have, and maybe in some new ways. So do you have some thoughts of your own that you would like to share from this intense conversation that's been unfolding, especially in the last year of unusual circumstances? It's a big one. Louise, would you like to start us off? You're muted now. Louise, you're muted.
Unmute, yeah.
There you go.
Unmute. Yes. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, I was rereading the. Yeah, one big first step is that we are now recognizing them. It's something that we didn't have terms for what was happening. Now we have the terms. Yeah, it's capitalism, it's supremacy, it's colonialism. It's a series of terms that we are now using and now detecting as part of the big structural problem. But now the hard part comes, the strategy, okay? What is our role as this diversity of people we have here? What is our role individually and collectively, okay, to address the situation? Because everybody recognizes capitalism as a root problem, but we have the big task of proposing an alternative system to capitalism, you know, and that's a big one. That's a big problem.
Yeah.
Because we can criticize capitalism, but where is the propositive part? What we proposed as an alternative, okay? The big system. We know what to propose about supremacy and colonialism, but for example, like an economic system is a big deal, big deal. And nobody's talking about that, at least at our level. Maybe economists, maybe social scientists, or political scientists. But what is our role in that, for example? Okay, that's a big question.
I'm going to let the other panelists respond to you rather than me moderate. So let's get a conversation going here. Anyone would like to respond to what Louise just put on the table?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can talk a little bit about how I'm trying to deal with things within my own research. So the pollinator conservation as a topic has become so popular since I started working on it like 15 years ago. And every spring people care about bees again, and it has not stopped being popular, which is a great thing, but it also means that I can leverage, if I'm thinking about power and resources, I can leverage the fact that it is an important or interesting topic for people to transfer those resources. So this example of this project where I'm working with an Indigenous art historian curator, that's an example of leveraging the fact that people are willing to pay for pollinator gardens and research around pollinator declines into a space where we can actually learn more about Indigenous artists and Indigenous history and the hard stuff that comes along with that as well. We also, when we do things like, these are small ways of transferring resources, but if we're doing speakers gifts, for example, we'll commission something from an Indigenous speaker, or when we think about hiring different students or whatever, we really like it comes into play with every decision that we make. If we're making a decision about asking for money or spending money or giving people opportunities, we're constantly thinking about how we can transfer the resources to more marginalized communities. So that's just kind of like a more concrete way of dealing with this, instead of thinking about sort of the bigger structures. And it's for me, it's a little bit of an easier conversation to have. Although obviously we need to think about the larger structures as well.
So I can speak to it. Can you hear me all right? Okay, I can speak to it from the forest preserves. I mean, we have established some position papers where we're looking at communities that have been impacted by racial inequities and how we're working to we're working to increase land access and access to programming. So in the past, land acquisition was done in a way where we're looking at, what was ecologically significant, what made sense in our ecological management plans. But now we're taking a step back to say, well, these communities impacted by racial inequities, is there a forest preserve near this community that we can purchase so that access to green spaces and the health benefits of having natural spaces and the eco benefits of that are accessible for the communities that have been impacted. And then that pulls over into really everything we've been doing, including our education programs, where we're finding job opportunities for impacted communities to be working in the forest preserves, whether it's doing land restoration, interpretation, education. So really, through all of our departments, we've been working really hard to be able to do that better.
Yeah, I'm hearing you all speak a lot about the redistribution of resources to like marginalized groups, and you know, an acknowledging of these things and trying to deconstruct white supremacy, colonial, and capitalism. As I was thinking about this question, I agree it's a very, very large question, kind of hard to hone in on, but I think a great place to start, just from my point of view, is within our school systems. Trying to bring about more scientists. It's so often that marginalized youth will fall through the cracks. We talk about, you know, science in the context of history is incredibly expansive, and it's rooted in curiosity and wanting to answer questions. But when kids are studying science in schools, or even young adults in universities, the barriers on what can and can't be science are so strict. And also, you know, if we look at learning institutions, as you know, I attended a predominantly white institution, a PWI. Marginalized students within these spaces are facing so many different barriers to their education, on top of the prejudice, the underrepresentation, and just a lot of times blatant like racism that their professors, TAs, you know, people they're interacting with every day are facing. So I think as we are trying to make room for scientists from diverse backgrounds and really create that representation, I think the education system is an essential place to start, because, you know, without them being able to rise through ranks, having resources and programming that allow and encourage them to be able to reach to, you know, the heights of science, you know, we're back at square one. We are going to be continuing to perpetuate this, you know, white dominated field. So redistribution of power, resources, making sure that students and undergrads have their support, making sure that in grad school they are getting ample access to help writing grants and things of that nature.
I love that, Taylor, because I kind of think that the field work in science that we do in the forest preserves is the really fun work that sometimes you don't get access to until you're in college. So my favorite part about teaching is being able to get kids super excited about getting out into nature and saying, this is science, touching this, being in this place, this is science. And then getting that reaction like, wait, what? This is outside of the classroom. So having a target and helping to make sure that everyone has access to these programs to augment the classroom science. How do we augment it so that you know, our science teachers they have a lot going on, and how can we make science better? How can our organizations, our institutions do that to supplement what's happening and get kids super excited about all the stuff that we're excited about, right?
Hi, friends, I'm back. Sorry about that, one of my glitches. So it sounds to me like I caught the last bit of that we've moved on to the question about different ways of knowing and understanding science and ecology. And so if I have that, if I'm right on where their trajectory here is, I'd love to follow this conversation a little bit more, that we're all here. We're all on this call because we've had access to, or the opportunity to have, people and places in our lives that have allowed us to look at things in a different way than maybe others in our fields. So we've already mentioned, thank you to Sheila for mentioning our friend Robin Kimmerer, certainly one of our visionaries and leaders in this, articulating how in her case, understanding things from her citizen Potawatomi background has really opened up doors for so many other readers and people. So some of our other folks on the panel who would like to speak to this, you know, might even be from your own experience. What is it that helped you to see the world in a different way than maybe you were taught in the classroom or from the books you read?
I'll
Take
jump
it
in
away.
real quick. Yeah. So again, I'm kind of taking us a little bit off course with science, but you know, I went through a formal teacher ed program through National Louis University, which is in Chicago, and I taught in Chicago public schools for some time before I got to the forest preserves. And I kind of joke that as a classroom teacher, you're kind of a classically trained teacher, right? The learning environment is something that we worry a lot about. How are we creating the best learning environment for our students? How are we controlling that learning environment, right? Classroom management. All of these pieces are things that you learn in a formal teacher education course. And then you get out into the field, and it's totally different. It's totally different. At that time, while I was in that teacher ed program, I was also teaching in community at the American Indian Center and through our education programs, and everything was outside. And it kind of changed my perspective on learning that it doesn't matter where you are, everything is an opportunity to learn with, right? So if you're walking down the street and you're seeing plants, these things have a story to tell us as we walk, you know. In science, we would call it ecological health indicators, right? You can look into a space and you can see if that land is wet, right? If it has certain plants. Around here, we have a lot of Phragmites. It's a non-native, it's an invasive species. But if you drive on the expressway and you see these giant plants with these big, beautiful plumes, it's telling you there's water under there. It's telling you a story. And that changed the way that I taught, because then everywhere you go is a classroom. But it also changes the way that you think about how you teach and how we're engaging in those stories of history. When you start looking at the land, you start looking at the plants. You have native plants, they have special stories. We have non-native invasive species that are very prevalent in our area, but a lot of these were brought over with a purpose that people have over time lost that story, right? Immigrant plants, dandelion, that's my favorite one to talk about. I love dandelion. Every part of this plant is edible, and it was very intentionally brought here for that purpose. But over time, that community has lost its relationship with that plant. So how do we rebuild all of these lost relationships, these broken relationships? And that's really, for me, that was a changing point as a teacher. That land can be just as big of a teacher in your classroom as you are, if you choose to take on that perspective and acknowledge it.
Sorry about that. Zoom, adventures in Zoom, right? But I think I'm good to go now. Others on this question, now that you've cleared your ears out. Taylor, Louise?
I think I can jump in just with the sort of more, yeah, just kind of like a personal feeling of needing to be more humble. We're taught as scientists, or at least I was taught as a scientist, that you have to like learn your subject area and defend it. I mean, we get our degrees by defending our ideas, sometimes to the death, not quite, but we're constantly defending our work through peer review, through grant applications. It's like this, it's a very, I guess, colonial mentality. But working with Lisa Myers on this other project, I've realized, well, first I was humbled in that I thought if I just collected the information about pollinator declines and gave it to the government, that they would like step in and start saving these animals that were going extinct. And when that didn't happen, and then there was all these other things with power and different stakeholders lobbying and all that stuff, how that all came into play, I realized that it's not as straightforward as me just collecting the information and giving it and finding a solution and working from there, right? Like there's so much other socio-cultural context that's involved with that. So working with Lisa, I've been really humbled to see how this Indigenous artist, Mike McDonald, how much knowledge he had when he was creating these pollinator gardens, how thoughtful he was. He planted one at Banff National Park, and it's the only one that still exists today. And as because it's in a national park, he had to go through all of this paperwork, as I'm sure many of you know when you're dealing with government. And I can just imagine how this Indigenous artist coming and telling the park biologist what plants should be allowed and what plants are not, like, would not be allowed, how, like, what that conflict must have sounded like. And if I was that biologist, how would I have treated him coming to me with this plant list? And Lisa has found that he actually, there was a plant there and the park biologist said, like, oh no, you can't introduce this. It was a type of nettle. And he actually showed them that the butterfly that specialized on that nettle did occur in the park, and thus the plant must be in the park. So he was right, they were wrong. And it was just this constant like back and forth of who gets to be like the keeper of the knowledge or the person who knows the one right thing around this situation. So I've just found it to just be so humbling. And I think I've become less confident in my ability to make strong statements and defend findings as I go on and realize how little I actually do know about my the subject matter that I'm considered an expert in, having written a book on the bumblebees of North America or what have you. So yeah, I think the theme is being a humble scientist and often being humbled through these discussions and just remembering that.
That's wonderful, Sheila. Thank you so much. Taylor, I got my eye on you because there's also a question for you from one of the folks who are listening in about teachers and mentors in your experience, and maybe it hooks into this question. As you think about your different ways of knowing and how you've come to your place, and how who are the teachers or mentors who did or did not help you to navigate these different ways of knowing the world?
Yeah, no, I feel really lucky in that going to a very large university as Northwestern my environmental science major was relatively small. I think my class, when we graduated of environmental science majors, there was like 12 of us. And so it really gave me an opportunity to build some really great relationships with a lot of my professors, particularly my professor, Chris Escogan, who I was able to work with at the Botanic Gardens. I think one thing that really introduced me into looking at science in different ways, similarly, was my experience in the field. We were working on a project that looked at the relationship between hawk moth pollinators with a specific type of flowering plant, Enothera, and she was able to actually fly me out to Texas and New Mexico to do field research there. And having the opportunity to do science and seeing this stuff in real time really challenged me and sparked my interest in this kind of work, really hands-on, up close and personal with the plants and organisms. I think also just by way of, or in terms of, learning to question science as it comes towards me, as I'm taking it in, I think that's very much also just a function of my identity as a Black woman, because I'm, Black people in general are so underrepresented in fields of science. Me not questioning it would then reinforce the idea that then we aren't present in these fields, which is not true. So from an early age, I kind of learned that I had to do my own research and find other avenues of learning that would give me more complete histories of these fields, more complete histories of really the ways that things function and work outside of our colonial kind of view of, these kind of things.
Yeah, as I'm listening, especially to our younger colleagues tonight, I'm really struck. As Louise said, there's a whole new vocabulary. And when it seems discouraging, it's important to step back and realize how, from the perspective of someone who's now in the later stages of their career, how quickly it may seem slow from your perspective, but with my perspective, it's like, wow, finally these questions are being asked. Finally, this language is being developed. Finally, these conversations are unfolding. So I'm watching the clock carefully because we have actually several more questions and I know we won't be able to do full justice to. So I'm going to kind of fold them into maybe a meta question here before we get on to some questions and answers from the audience. And I think we can do this. I think if we think of these several questions in front of us, we can group them. And that is to ask, where do we go going forward? And this is both from our own personal perspective and experience, as well as the institutions we work within or around or through. But how can we move ahead? What are the actions we can take to move consciously forward collectively and individually? Maybe there's something in your own field or discipline that has impressed you as something effective, that has made a real difference. And this is a point where it is a little uncomfortable because we do come from so many different worlds and backgrounds. Some of us, like myself, are in a position of being allies. And I'll quickly mention that in my own work as a conservationist in my own home landscape, this is very much a part of what I've been working on for 25 years, actually working with the Ho-Chunk Nation. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral territory of the Ho-Chunk people. And working with them as an ally has been one of the most important things I've learned, and had nothing to do with my PhD, and nothing to do with my scientific training, has everything to do with knowing and respecting the history and the people. So both in terms of trying to be a better ally and what is needed from allies. And all of us are going to be in those roles, right? Some of us are going to be allies, some are going to need allies. So I open this up to anyone, but again, I'm looking at Louise here because I may have missed it, but I want to make sure Louise has a chance to speak equally too. Again, what can we do, some specific actions perhaps that you've seen or would like to see to help us advance?
Well, the center, the conversation and the discussion on these topics we're dealing with now is science itself. And science itself has a core, and this core is the scientific method, okay? And it's also the scientific protocols, like peer review mentioned by several of the panelists. And this part is the hardcore. It's difficult to change that. If you change that, then you are not doing science. You're doing anything else but science. And the difficult part is to introduce this on a digestible way, because it's not easy to digest. With my students, I mention that I also I delivered the seminar on scientific method and philosophy at the university. Well, I didn't mention it, but I did in the last 6 or 7 years. And that's a very difficult to swallow for students, okay? Because of course, there are many ideas they have, very romantic, but then you stumble against the wall of the scientific facts that sometimes don't go with your more cherished ideas. So that's a difficult part. For me, that's the most difficult part, because I have students from many social strata, economically speaking, for many different cultural backgrounds from the Republic of Mexico. And I see how they struggle with this problem of dealing with the scientific method at the obtention of facts that somehow challenge their preconceived ideas. That, I think that's the big challenge.
Mm.
Yeah, that's at the center of the challenge. Okay.
Right. I'm wondering, can some of the other panelists respond to maybe what Louise has just shared, and how you think about that, the core of the science versus now the social dimensions of how the science unfolds?
That's a big problem.
Yeah.
I think.
I think one thing that we're not used to thinking about is that we don't actually have to know everything and understand everything. I'm always so struck by the scientists and the ecologists who are all of a sudden these like anti-racism experts. But we actually have scholars, academics, our colleagues at our institutions who are critical race analysts or social scientists and have had all sorts of training in ethics and all sorts of things that is not typically part of training in ecology or science in general. So I'm always really struck, and I'm seeing a lot of it. And all of a sudden, all of these people are like DEI experts, and I'm just wondering, like, how does one become that? I don't know. I am certainly not an expert, even though I've lived, to some extent, part of this. And I do, workshops and leadership training and what have you. But I think we try to tackle too much on our own without acknowledging that actually we should be collaborating and transferring, again, resources and power over to people who might actually be able to do this better than us. They might be able to come to the solutions and bring the knowledge that is needed. So we have to be more collaborative. And again, that's not really what our training sets us up to be. We're always competing with each other. So it requires a totally different shift in mindset to share and to collaborate and to appreciate diverse perspectives. And I run into this tension a lot in my own university. But it's definitely possible. I mean, we don't always have to be fighting against each other and competing with each other. It would actually be probably a better way to live. So trying to move towards that sort of the learning from the mutual aid type frameworks and what communities, how they overcome challenges, all of this thing, it's been done. We don't need to figure it out ourselves, but we have to be open to admitting that we don't have the answers. The hardest part.
I can speak from, an organizational standpoint. The Forest Preserves of Cook County has a racial equity, diversity, and inclusion committee, and it's was tasked with many things, writing position paper, training staff on diversity, and doing, what Sheila was talking about is, right, who's the expert, and if we don't have expertise in-house, how are we working to make sure that we have this expert access to this expertise, and really creating a venue for these conversations to happen. This committee really took on writing the land acknowledgement, and I was super excited about it, and I didn't see it coming, and then it happened fast, and then that opened the door for many other opportunities, right? So, we use prescribed burns in the forest preserves, and we have for a while now, but that's a relatively new thing, using fire as a management tool, right? That was for a long time, fire was suppressed for many reasons, right? And we're seeing some of those impacts now, not exclusively because of fire suppression. Global climate change is certainly a factor there, but having a venue to have conversations about diverse land management practices and tribal land management practices, and having a safe space within your organization to do that, super important. So
that's a good lead in to mention that one of the comments and questions from a listener had to do with, we are seeing more land acknowledgements and different settings and events and so forth, but as scientists too, so much of our work involves getting published, right? And it makes a good point that we don't often see land acknowledgements so far in published work. So that's something specific that we can all think about going forward. Maybe there are some examples of that. Taylor, do you have some thoughts on, I know that's a lot to put on your plate here, but this question of being an ally or being allied, and maybe some things from your own work that give you some hope as we go forward on these immense challenges.
Yeah, most definitely. I think moving things that I've seen throughout my own field and what gives me hope is, I think more recently as these alternative ways of knowing herbal medicine in particular, but just access to the sciences, not necessarily through these large institutions, are being popularized. I see more and more Black people coming into these spaces and reclaiming their histories and re-understanding or reestablishing the understanding and connection with the land and the plants, especially as, a lot of marginalized communities don't necessarily always have access to the land, access to the time that it takes to really dive into subjects like this. Seeing more and more of this turnout and just having people reach out to me or being in communication with people of these identities, reestablishing these connections give me a lot of hope. I think moving forward, a really important thing to take note of in regards of allyship, both within the science and outside of the sciences, is just listening and being open to learning from experts or people whose experiences intersect with a lot of these issues. I think, while I am so happy that a lot of these conversations are happening by a lot of institutions, especially since this past summer, a lot of, institutions have stepped forward and really trying to look and reflect on their histories of racism and colonialism. And it's really amazing. Within the sciences and outside of the sciences, marginalized groups, Black people have been voicing their concerns and their expressions of inequity for a really long time now. And I think an unfortunate thing is oftentimes Black people, brown people, people of color have the burden of proof. They have to enter these spaces with statistics, with graphs, with case studies, trying to prove that their experiences are real and valid. And I think shifting that mentality and being willing to listen to experiences, listening to experts around these things and being open to actual concrete change, giving up power and resources are so important for any measure of allyship at all.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Mindful of the time, I know that we only have about 5 more minutes and there's so much more to say. And we want to leave enough time at the end for our hosts at the Notebaert Museum to wrap us up. But I'm looking at some of the questions that have been coming in from our viewers and listeners here. And maybe we've touched on a couple of these already. Maybe I'll go to the last one here, which focuses more on the policy arena. And especially at this moment when we are in turmoil politically in this country. And it's been a long time in making this turmoil, but we were heading into some uncertainty, obviously. So maybe we could close it off with every one of our panelists, if you wish, sharing a few thoughts on policy and how we can begin to move forward, even with some stiff winds blowing right now. And what can we learn from these movements? And as I'm reading this question, I want to make one quick point. It was 30 years ago, next fall, 2021, that we will mark the 30th anniversary of the landmark moment in the history of the environmental justice movement. It was the big meeting in Washington, D.C. on environmental justice in the fall of 1991, and I'm old enough to remember it. And maybe, so I'm going to ask it the question this way. In this next year, as we mark this 30 years since that big event, maybe what can we do in the policy arena? What would you hope to see in the policy arena that can make a tangible difference on all these big questions of science, knowledge, justice, different ways of knowing and seeing? And that can be from local to state to global to national to tribal. It's a big one.
I guess I can jump in here. I'm not sure.
Okay, Sheila?
Okay, so I'm a scientist and we're told to train future scientists. We have something in Canada called highly qualified personnel, and our grants are, ranked in terms of how many future scientists that we've produced, which, is so silly when you think about it. But for me, I think it's so important for scientists to actually become politically engaged and just get rid of that myth that somehow science is not political, because everything we do around science is political. Who gets to do science is political. Where you get the money to do your science is political. And training future politicians is not a bad thing. Training people who will go into careers that will actually influence change because they have different perspectives or what have you. Supporting political parties, giving your scientific expertise and helping to inform policy in that way. Like, all of these things should be happening. We shouldn't pretend that somehow if you're a scientist, you have to be nonpartisan or what have you. So I'm just gonna embrace the fact that I am gonna be involved in activism. And I've had some grants that have said she's more of an activist than a scientist. And, you just kind of have to laugh and move on. But science is political. And I think just understanding, and I think in the US, it's become quite clear that over the past 4 years that science is clearly political. Your ability to do science, not just in terms of the research funding, but your actual physically emotional capacity to do your work while all of this is going on, is completely affected by everything political. So I think that we just need to keep moving on with that in mind, that we cannot separate science from politics.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the big part of, we have to flex the political muscle, because if you see the politics on the United States, in Mexico, science has been overlooked almost totally. Okay. So, and also our big error was not doing enough scientific divulgation, because in that way the community didn't become aware of the importance of science on daily life. For example, this panel we are having now with satellites circumventing the Earth, and we in different cities talking in real time, is taken for granted. But it was a product of the correct application of the scientific method. And almost nobody is aware of that. It's taken for granted. Okay. And we are culprits in big part, because we don't acknowledge the community on those facts. Okay. And for people, it's very easy to overlook this. In general.
Adam and Taylor, some closing thoughts from you on sort of the policy aspects of this, or maybe more broadly, just our role as citizens in our changing democracy?
I'll jump in because I'm going to echo what Taylor already said. Thanks, Taylor. Just to listen to impacted communities by racial inequity, just listening. I know, as I'm a public servant, and I hope that I'm a good listener and that I'm making the decisions for programming and moving forward that are reflective of what communities are asking for. And so that's for me. I hope that I'm a good listener moving forward, and I would hope that our policymakers are too.
Amen. Taylor, you get the last word.
Well, yeah, I think it's just a way to, reiterate the other ideas that have been said, seeing the ways that policy intersects with science and that they can't exist, separate from one another, giving opportunity to, marginalized peoples to enter the sciences, and also acknowledging the ways that policy allows certain people to practice and not practice science, I think.
Wow. I'm looking at the rest of these questions, including ones that have just come in, and I'm saying to myself that we are so engaged in these questions right now in a way we've never been before. And if it feels overwhelming or frustrating or inspiring all at the same time, it's because I think we're in a moment, and I think we all sense it in our own different ways. So I'm going to close off my portion here just by saying thank you, because in some ways, those of us who are elders have been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. And it's deeply rewarding to hear younger voices chiming in and pushing to make the changes that we know have to happen. And there's not going to be an easy way through it. But I'm encouraged, because if we didn't have that engagement, it would truly be a dark time. So I'm going to mention again a thanks to the Chicago Academy of Sciences and the Notebaert, and let Zach perhaps take it home for us.
Yep. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, all of the panelists. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, all of our guests, for joining us tonight. And then one more thank you to our Founders Week sponsor, Rose Best Solution, for all the support they give us. If you enjoyed this conversation, please visit naturemuseum.org and sign up for our newsletter to find out future programs. If you're able to, please donate at naturemuseum.org/donate. Your support helps programs like this in the future. We hope to see you all again in the near future, and have a nice night, everyone. Thank you.